this in class. I don't have time for this in class because we have so much to get through. And I think that is one of the challenges and one of the reasons you don't see higher order thinking going on in the classroom all the time, because we are under pressure, both time-wise and also from the washback from exams which don't necessarily test higher order thinking. But it's still, I would argue that the students leaving the class, I bet they've learned those 5 words far better than those 5 words, because they've had to do so much more with them and really work with them, and it's really challenged them. So that's sort of exercises we set. There's also materials. Typically we often associate critical thinking with reading text, listening text and so on. The problem is, if you take a reading text into class which has been adapted or changed to teach language, quite often there's nothing to think critically about. You've got to take something into class that actually gives students a platform to discuss something. And I think you can do it. Sometimes teachers say to me, you can't get much critical thinking going on in elementary classes or pre-intermediate classes. But sometimes you can choose text. Here's a text I liked. I liked it initially because I like text which has strong visual impact, because students have a way into the topic. And also you're dealing with visual learners nowadays a lot of the time who like high-impact images. Plus sometimes they look at the length of the reading text and they say, well, I don't even read a text that long in my own language anymore, because reading has changed. This text was interesting because it was a South Korean photographer who started taking photographs of friends' children in South Korea. And she took a few pictures and noticed the girls had really pink bedrooms and the boys had really blue bedrooms. And she thought, is this really a thing? If you go to her website here, you will see hundreds of South Korean children in blue bedrooms and pink bedrooms. And it goes on and on. It's quite phenomenal. She's done another section called Colours. She also found the same to be true in the United States a lot of the time. But what I liked about this text was I could adapt it for the lower level, but it was about cultural stereotypes, it was about gender, it was about consumerism. It was actually about something that students could express opinions on. And always when we're looking for reading text, we want something that will demand a response. There's interesting facts. For example, in 1910, in the United States, it was considered fashionable to dress your boys in pink and your girls in blue. It only changed in the 1950s because of Disneyfication. It is a word. It's the influence of Walt Disney, and suddenly princesses wore pink, princes wore blue. So everybody changed what they were doing. So first of all, for thinking critically about the material, it's got to be about something. The other thing we tend to do as teachers, having just talked about questions, is that we often kill texts by asking a load of comprehension questions. Now, we may be doing this because the exam demands it, or we just want to check. And yes, I use comprehension questions to check understanding. But of course, we can make a text do so much more. We could have the students compare their room as a child with those in the photos. Anybody in here, when they were a child, did you have a pink room? Anybody have a blue room? Oh, here we go. And suddenly we can start asking out, what does your room, and people start thinking, well, what colour was my room when I was a kid? Instead of the teacher asking the questions, remember, getting the students to ask more questions, they can write 3 questions for the photographer, then read the text, see if the answer's in the text. My students say to me, but I didn't find all the answers in the text. And I said, well, that's not a problem, because she has a website, so for homework, go and try to find the answer on the text. So suddenly they're driving the agenda. What's great nowadays is, when I was a materials writer 20 years ago, I could just make up a text. It didn't matter if it was true or not, so I just put it in the course book. Now my students are all Googling to check that it's real and that it exists. So we may as well really make use of it. You ever had those lessons as well when you think the reading will inspire a debate or students to express opinions? And you say, so what do you think? And nobody has an opinion, and you leave the class, go back to the teacher's room and say, oh, that class, they don't have opinions about anything, I can't get them to discuss. Quite often happens is because we're just not leaving that thinking time that we need to. One technique I've started using for reading text is I know that my students are reading texts online, and when they read them, say in social media, there's a little box where they can write a comment about their feelings about the text afterwards. So I simulate this in class, although I make sure that they keep their language pleasant. But they imagine that they've read the text online, they fill in an imaginary online comment box, and then I ask them for their opinion. And because I give them a very real kind of context, they just spend a bit more time writing it and think, well, what would I write if I saw this online? So it's giving them an authentic reason to express an opinion. Also with text with photos like this, I like to get students to use their cameras, and this is where we get onto more creative thinking. So with this text for homework, I'd say, for homework, take your own photograph on the theme of colour and present it at the next lesson. So they would just, for homework, they'd take the photo and then give a presentation on where they saw it, why they took it, what aspect of their life is it talking about. And they're really having to engage with the text. They're using a lot of critical and creative thinking to do it. Which brings me to the last part. We've looked at these three, but I just want us to think about creative thinking. As teachers, we often do lots of work on comprehension, and then we often jump to creativity and creative thinking tasks. Maybe we miss out the critical thinking sometimes. A very good book called Developing Thinking by Deborah McGregor, and I like her definition of the two, because they're often presented separately. But McGregor says critical thinking is basically convergent thinking. That you're analysing, evaluating information and data, which seems to be the opposite to creative thinking, which is divergent thinking. It's literally thinking outside the box. And I tend to think if creative thinking is thinking outside the box, critical thinking is useful because it's thinking inside the box. In fact, it's thinking about how is the box constructed? What structure can we steal from something? And McGregor said actually these two seem to be opposite, but when they're working really well together, students' creative and critical thinking is improved so much. I'm going to demonstrate this to you now. Imagine we've got a lesson on storytelling. So a very creative type of class. Okay? Before you ask students to write their story, it's better to give them some kind of model and get them thinking about the model. So, who's this? This is Nemo. Nemo comes from one of the most creative thinking companies in the world called Pixar. And everybody thinks it's wonderful because the animation's so good. That isn't why Pixar, it's one of the reasons Pixar films are good, but the real reason is their storytelling skills. And Pixar have a secret. And if you're a parent with kids and you have to go to the cinema and watch, or you've got on video and you've watched Finding Nemo 20 times already, here's a way to relieve the boredom. Do a little bit of critical thinking about the storytelling in the film, and you will discover the Pixar secret. And if students discover this, or you teach this, they discover that it has a 6-sentence structure. Once upon a time there was a fish called Nemo. Every day Nemo went to school. One day Nemo got lost. Because of that, his father went to look for him. Because of that, his father finally found him, until finally he brought him home. Now, I've tried this with other Pixar films, and this is the structure they're using. And as soon as you've used your critical thinking and discovered the structure, you actually produce a really good piece of writing, and your creative thinking is so much better. And yes, you have some students in your class who like writing stories, but not all students find it easy. They need some kind of structure, and they have analytical minds. Let's try this out. In 1 minute, using this structure, you can produce a pretty perfectly formed story, okay? With the person next to you, I'm going to give you the first sentence of this story, and then you're going to brainstorm the structure using it, okay? In about 1 minute. Here we go. Ready? Creative hats on. Once upon a time there was an English teacher from Rome. Go, write the rest of the story. Use about structure? Story now, you might go off and redraft it. But by thinking about structure, your creative thinking is much better. We do the same thing when we teach students how to write an essay. If they analyse a model version, they produce a much better piece of writing. It's also true in terms of speaking. One of the things I've been doing recently is a lot more video work, and to break away from listenings in course materials sounding inauthentic and scripted, I'm using video a lot more and just interviewing people in the street and so on. In some material I recently did, I asked a student if she'd be happy to be recorded. She's giving a presentation, a show and tell presentation. It lasts 1 minute. And it's a really nice example of some creative and critical thinking work that went on. She's chosen an object from home and she presents a little story behind it. And the other interesting thing, if you video somebody doing the task and then you show it to your students, you get much better quality work from them because you've shown them an example of what you want them to achieve. It's very sort of visible, the outcome. What I'd like to do, while you watch her do a presentation, can you identify a structure? Do your critical thinking, analyse and evaluate. Is there a structure to her presentation? Okay, there's no sound. Mr. Man. We good?
This is my mom's dress. She was born in 1955 in Moscow, in Russia, and she got married in the 70s, so she made this dress to wear the day after her wedding. She got married in the summer, so it was very hot. Many years later, I found this dress in my mum's wardrobe, and I thought, wow, such a great dress. So I started to wear it a lot, and my friends asked me, wow, who's the designer, where does it come from? It's very important to me because it reminds me of my mum, of my family, and of my home, where I was born and where I grew up.
It was a very nice personal presentation, but the reason it really works is it has a very clear structure. When we set it up, she looked at other examples of good presentations. And if you think of get students to analyse the structure first, they discover it has a clear beginning, middle, end. And then they identify the type of language you use. You can see that she's got the introduction, then the background to it, and then finishes saying why it's important. If you do that work beforehand, you naturally get much better presentations when the students come to do it, instead of those presentations which drift for quite a long time. But that analytical work really improves it. You can't separate the critical from the creative thinking. They really work very well together. It doesn't stop there. If you, I sound like a sales rep now, if she's given a presentation, you can get students to evaluate each other. I'm sure you've done this kind of thing. Now, you could give them that kind of presentation form so they assess each other. They're doing some reflective thinking, they're using some critical thinking to assess the performance. And that's fine, and it's a bit like can-do statements. It's a bit like getting students to peer assess each other's writing. It works the same with presentations. But if you've got time and you really want students to think critically, you can also save yourself a lot of time as a teacher. You just give them a blank version. Before the presentation, you put them in groups and say, what are the 5 characteristics of a good presentation? They identify them. And then they use their own assessment form to evaluate their own performance and each other. And again, they leave the class with a far better idea of what makes a good presentation. Clearly, as a teacher, we steer them in the right direction, but they're having to really think deeply about what it is, so they're thinking critically about what makes a good presentation. That's the balance between the critical and the creative. Which brings me to the end. At the beginning, I presented this as a sort of an interpretation of lower and higher order thinking. Notice it's horizontal, because you can't have higher without lower and vice versa. I don't see them as one more and better than another. It's just these things need to happen within a class. I'm going to finish with giving you a little bit of homework. But don't worry, I'm not going to mark it. Well, I'm not going to worry now. I'm not going to mark it, but try it out. You can self-observe your own lesson or observe other teachers just by doing this. I use this mentally when I'm writing lessons, course book material. So this reflects the length of the lesson. Maybe you've got a 60-minute lesson on that axis. The different exercises and stages to the lesson could either be lower or higher. Now, it's not scientific, it's a judgment, it's a subjective opinion, but you have a feel about a classroom exercise when you do it. And you think about your lesson and you draw a trend line. Here's a couple of examples. This is pretty typical of an elementary, pre-intermediate type lesson. The teachers presented some new language. The students have done some kind of controlled practice, gap fill type exercise here. And then maybe the teachers asked them to do something more creative or critical 2/3 of the way into the lesson. Maybe it's a speaking, a problem-solving activity. And then the teacher gives feedback at the end, and we're back to lower order thinking, the teacher's telling. In lower level classes, you'll have a greater proportion of lower order thinking activities just by the nature of levels. This is quite typical of upper intermediate classes. Students might brainstorm something, then they evaluate their brainstorming, they think about it, maybe then they watch a video, they do some comprehension checking work, then they get another problem solving task. And notice at the end here, the teacher gave the feedback, but in this lesson, the students gave each other peer feedback, so they were still using their critical thinking there. And that's more typical of higher levels. But not necessarily the case. There are plenty of lessons I observe where it's all just lower order thinking and the students never get a chance to experiment. Equally, you don't want a whole lesson with higher order thinking all the way through. Students need, even higher level students want that more control time. So it's just a way of thinking about your lesson. And I hope it kind of demystifies this idea that critical thinking is something difficult in your teaching. If you're interested, a whole load of references there. My website at the top, you can get a copy of the slides. You can also contact me via that. I'm around for the next 24 hours, so feel free to come up to me and challenge me in the corridor and say you disagree or whatever, ask me a question, that's fine. But these are references. The show and tell video, if you want to use it next week, it's free to use online. You can show your students the picture of that student giving her presentation, then get them to do something similar. And if you're super keen, you can go to the National Geographic stand and buy a copy of my book, which is quite a thin read, okay? But it was my attempt to make sense of the whole critical thinking in English language teaching. All right, thank you very much for attending.